In 32 years of studying how nations project power, I have learned that the most effective attacks are not the ones that destroy what you can see. They are the ones that destroy what you cannot see. The infrastructure that is so fundamental to modern life that its existence has become invisible, assumed, taken for granted, noticed only in the moment of its absence. Right now, at this moment, approximately 436 submarine cables are carrying 95% of all international internet traffic across the floors of every ocean on Earth. Not satellites, cables. The submarine cable network is not a backup system for satellite communications. It is the primary system. Satellites carry approximately 5% of international internet traffic. The cables carry the rest. Every Google search, every financial transaction, every military communication that travels between allied nations, every email, every video call, every cloud computing operation, every artificial intelligence query, every banking instruction, every stock market trade, 95% of all of it travels through cables that sit on the ocean floor, unprotected, unmonitored for most of their length, and physically vulnerable to cutting in ways that no defensive architecture has ever been adequately resourced to prevent. At 11:47 last night, Russian naval assets, operating in coordinated pairs across 7 simultaneous locations in the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Baltic Sea, and the approaches to the Pacific, executed the most precisely coordinated infrastructure attack in the history of warfare. 42 submarine cables cut in 11 minutes across 4 ocean basins simultaneously. The cables that went dark carry 95% of transatlantic internet traffic, 87% of European Asian internet traffic, and the specific military communications infrastructure that links American naval commands in Europe with their operational areas. As of this morning, the internet is not slow, it is not congested, it is functionally dead for the purposes of the international communications that the global economy depends upon. And the repair timeline, the time required to locate 42 cable breaks across ocean floors and restore communications, is measured not in hours or days but in months. Tonight, I want to walk you through exactly how Russia cut the cables, exactly what 95% internet loss means for every dimension of modern civilization, and exactly what a world that runs without the infrastructure it did not know it depended on looks like. Tonight, I want to answer 4 questions that nobody in the mainstream commentary is addressing with the honesty 42 severed cables demands. First, how did Russia cut 42 submarine cables in 11 minutes across 4 ocean basins simultaneously? What specific naval assets, what specific operational planning, and what specific intelligence preparation made this the most precisely coordinated infrastructure attack in warfare history? And how long has this operation been in preparation? Second, what does 95% global internet loss actually mean? Walk me through every system that depends on submarine cable connectivity. Financial markets, military communications, supply chain management, healthcare infrastructure, emergency services, and explain what each system looks like when the connectivity it requires has been severed for months rather than hours. Third, why cannot the cables be quickly repaired? Walk me through the specific technical, logistical, and operational challenges of locating and repairing 42 cable breaks across deep ocean floors, and explain why the repair timeline that cable restoration requires gives Russia months of communications advantage that no satellite backup can adequately compensate for. And fourth, what is Russia's strategic objective in cutting the cables? What specific military, economic, and geopolitical outcomes does a world operating without reliable international internet connectivity produce that serves Russian strategic interests? And what does the timing of the cut tell us about the relationship between cable severance and the broader conflict trajectory? Stay with me, because the answers describe an attack whose consequences reach every person on Earth who has touched a screen in the past decade. If you came here for the analysis that explains why 42 severed cables affect every person watching this video, subscribe now. Hit like, share this with anyone whose work, savings, or daily life depends on internet connectivity. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read everyone. Now let us get into this completely. Let me start with the operation itself, because the mainstream coverage has characterized the cable cutting as a straightforward act of sabotage, a relatively simple operation that Russia could have executed at any time. That characterization misses the operational complexity that cutting 42 cables in 11 minutes across 4 ocean basins simultaneously required. This operation was not simple. It was the product of years of preparation whose specific phases reveal an intelligence collection and operational planning effort of extraordinary depth and duration. Phase 1, Cable Mapping. The locations of submarine cables are not secret. The cable industry publishes route maps for commercial and navigational purposes. Ships need to know where cables are to avoid anchoring on them. What the published maps do not show is the specific depth profile along each cable's route, the precise coordinates of the cable at each point along its length, or the specific locations where cable characteristics make cutting most effective and most difficult to repair. Russian naval intelligence has been conducting systematic bathymetric surveys of submarine cable routes for 20 years, mapping not just where the cables are, but where they sit on the ocean floor, what sediment covers them, and what the local current patterns are that affect both cutting operations and repair operations. The intelligence preparation for this operation began long before the current conflict. Phase 2, Asset Positioning. 11 minutes of simultaneous operation across 7 geographic locations required assets pre-positioned at each cutting location before the operation began. Russian naval assets, specifically the Yantar-class oceanographic research vessels and the Logistical deep-diving special-purpose submarines that have been shadowing submarine cable routes for years under the cover of scientific research, were positioned at their cutting locations over a period of weeks. The Yantar-class vessels are not oceanographic research ships. They are intelligence collection and underwater infrastructure interference platforms whose research cover has been noted by Western naval analysts for a decade and whose specific capabilities, deep diving submersibles, cable manipulation equipment, bottom survey sonar, precisely match the requirements of a cable cutting operation. The positioning of 7 Yantar-class equivalents and their associated deep-diving submersibles at 7 cable-cutting locations over weeks of patient pre-positioning required no dramatic operational movement that American naval intelligence would have assessed as immediate threat. They were simply doing what they always do, conducting research in waters where cables happen to run. Phase 3, the 11-minute execution. At a coordinated time signal, 7 deep-diving submersibles deployed from their host vessels and descended to their designated cable positions. Each submersible carried the specific cutting equipment, hydraulic shears, diamond wire cutters, or explosive severance charges, depending on the cable depth and burial status at the designated cutting point, required for the specific cable type at its specific location. The 11-minute total operation duration reflects the coordination discipline required to ensure that no single cutting event provided sufficient warning for any other location to be alerted and defended before its own cutting was complete. 11 minutes from first cut to last cut. 42 cables severed, 4 ocean basins affected. The preparation that made 11 minutes possible took years. I want to walk through the consequences of 95% international internet loss with the system-by-system specificity that every person whose life depends on internet connectivity deserves, because the phrase internet loss is inadequate to describe what 42 severed submarine cables actually produces. The internet is not one system, it is the infrastructure on which hundreds of critical systems run. And when 95% of the international bandwidth that carries those systems is severed, the consequences do not affect the internet. They affect everything the internet carries. Financial markets and banking. The global financial system's real-time operation depends on submarine cable connectivity for the transaction processing, the settlement systems, and the market data distribution that allow financial markets to function. The SWIFT international payment system, through which trillions of dollars in international financial transactions are processed daily, depends on submarine cable connectivity for the message transmission that every international payment requires. As of this morning, SWIFT processing is operating at approximately 3% of normal volume. 3%. The 97% of international payment processing that is not occurring represents a financial paralysis whose daily cost to the global economy exceeds the combined economic output of every nation on Earth for one day. Every day that the cables remain severed adds another day's worth of financial paralysis to the global economic disruption. International trade financing, the letters of credit, the payment guarantees, the currency hedging instruments that allow physical goods to move between nations, cannot be processed without SWIFT connectivity. Physical goods whose financing cannot be processed do not move. The container ships sitting in ports waiting for financing instructions that cannot be transmitted are the most visible indicator of a supply chain disruption whose consequences will reach consumer shelves within 30 days. Military communications. The specific cables cut include the communications infrastructure that carries the encrypted military communications linking American European commands with their operational areas, NATO's command and control architecture, and the intelligence sharing networks whose bandwidth requirements exceed satellite communication capacity. Military satellite communications are not a complete substitute for cable-based military communications. They provide sufficient bandwidth for voice communications and low-volume data exchange. They do not provide the bandwidth required for the high-volume intelligence data transmission, the real-time surveillance data sharing, and the command and control messaging density that modern military operations require. NATO military operations whose communications have shifted from cable to satellite are NATO military operations operating with a command and control bandwidth reduction of approximately 80%. 80% bandwidth reduction does not stop military operations. It makes them significantly slower, significantly less informed, and significantly more vulnerable to the specific Russian intelligence collection capability that satellite communications expose more readily than cable communications. Cloud computing and artificial intelligence, the global cloud computing infrastructure, the data center networks that process the computing tasks of corporations, governments, and individuals, operates through submarine cable connections between data centers whose geographic distribution spans ocean basins. A data center in Virginia serving European customers through cables that are now severed cannot serve those customers. The computing capacity that European businesses depend on for their daily operations, email processing, database queries, transaction processing, artificial intelligence services, is not available through the severed cable infrastructure. The economic cost of cloud computing unavailability to European businesses is assessed at approximately $40 billion per day. For every day the cables remain severed, healthcare infrastructure, the telemedicine systems, the remote diagnostic equipment, the pharmaceutical supply chain management systems, and the medical research data sharing infrastructure that modern healthcare depends on, all of it runs on the same submarine cable connectivity that 42 cuts have severed. A hospital in London whose patient record system runs on cloud infrastructure in American data centers, connected through cables that are now cut, is a hospital whose clinical decision support systems are unavailable. The healthcare infrastructure consequence is the most quietly catastrophic dimension of the cable severance, not dramatic, not visible on a screen, but accumulating in every clinical decision that is made without the data support that cable connectivity provided. I want to address the repair timeline with the technical specificity that months rather than days demands, because the mainstream coverage has implied that cable repair is a straightforward technical process whose timeline is primarily a matter of mobilizing resources. The timeline is not primarily a matter of resources. It is primarily a matter of physics. Repairing a submarine cable break requires 4 sequential steps, whose individual timelines are constrained by physical limitations that no amount of additional resource can significantly compress. Step 1. Fault location. A submarine cable break does not announce its precise location. The break is known to exist. The loss of signal from the cable's monitoring system confirms that connectivity has been severed, but the specific location of the break requires active fault location procedures. The standard fault location method uses time domain reflectometry, sending a signal into the cable and measuring the time for a reflection to return from the break point. The measurement accuracy of time domain reflectometry is sufficient to locate the break to within approximately 1 kilometer of cable length, 1 kilometer of cable, on the ocean floor, whose precise position relative to surface coordinates depends on the cable's route geometry, the accuracy of the original route survey, and the local current patterns that may have shifted the cable's position since the original survey. The fault location process for a single break in a well-surveyed cable in good weather conditions takes approximately 48 to 72 hours. For 42 breaks across cables whose routes span ocean depths to 5,000 meters, in ocean basins whose weather conditions include the North Atlantic winter, the fault location phase alone requires months of sequential survey operations. Step 2. Cable ship positioning. There are approximately 70 cable repair ships in the global fleet. 42 simultaneous breaks across 4 ocean basins require 42 separate repair operations, each requiring a cable ship, a crew, and the specific repair equipment matched to the cable type at the break location. The global cable repair fleet does not have 42 ships available for simultaneous deployment to optimal positions. It has approximately 15 to 20 ships that can be mobilized within weeks. The remaining operations must be queued behind the first deployments, waiting for ships to complete their first repair and reposition. The sequential repair timeline for 42 breaks with 15 to 20 available ships is approximately 8 to 12 months at the most optimistic repair tempo. Step 3. Deepwater repair. For cable breaks at depths below 3,000 meters, which includes approximately 60% of the 42 cuts, based on the cutting locations, repair requires remotely operated vehicles capable of operating at the relevant depth, with the cable handling equipment required to bring the cable to the surface for splicing. The ROV operations required for deepwater cable repair are among the most technically demanding remote operations in the offshore industry. Each deepwater repair requires approximately 5 to 7 days of ROV operation for the lifting, splicing, and relaying sequence. 5 to 7 days per break for the deepwater portion of 42 breaks. Step 4. Russian interference with repair operations. This is the step that the mainstream coverage has not addressed. The repair ships operating in the North Atlantic and Baltic approaches to repair severed cables are operating in waters where Russian naval assets remain present. The specific Russian naval assets that conducted the original cutting operation remain in the operational area. Their capacity to interfere with repair operations through harassment, through additional cutting of repaired cables, through the operational pressure that proximity to Russian naval assets imposes on civilian cable repair vessels, is a constraint on repair tempo that no technical solution can address. Russia can extend the repair timeline indefinitely by recutting repaired sections. The repair timeline is not ultimately bounded by technical factors. It is bounded by the strategic resolution of the conflict that produced the cutting. I want to address Russia's strategic objective with the directness that an operation of this scale and preparation demands, because the cable cutting is not primarily a communications disruption operation. It is a strategic environment modification, a deliberate reshaping of the operational context in which every other dimension of the conflict proceeds. The specific strategic outcomes that 95% international internet loss produces for Russian interests are 4. Financial market disruption. A global financial system operating at 3% of normal transaction volume is a financial system that cannot efficiently process the sanctions, the asset freezes, and the financial isolation measures that American and European governments employ as their primary non-military coercive tool against Russia. Sanctions require financial system functionality to impose. They require the ability to track transactions, freeze accounts, and deny access to payment systems that operate through the cable infrastructure that has been severed. A severed financial infrastructure is a sanctions infrastructure that cannot be operated at full effectiveness. Russia has not just cut the internet, it has cut the enforcement mechanism for the financial warfare that Western governments have spent 3 years using against it. Military communications degradation. The 80% NATO command and control bandwidth reduction I described in part 2 is not a uniform degradation. It is a specific degradation that affects some operations more than others. The operations most severely affected are the high bandwidth intelligence intensive operations, the real-time intelligence sharing, the surveillance data distribution, the command and control density that modern precision warfare requires. The operations least affected are lower bandwidth operations, voice communications, basic command authority, simple logistics coordination. Russia's military operations are designed for the lower bandwidth environment. American and NATO operations are designed for the high bandwidth environment. The cable severance moves the operational environment from high bandwidth, where American and NATO doctrine has overwhelming advantage, to low bandwidth, where Russian doctrine is more competitive. Russia has not just cut communications, it has moved the conflict into the operational bandwidth, where its doctrine is most effective. Economic pressure on Western governments. $40 billion per day of European cloud computing disruption. The financial market paralysis. The supply chain disruption whose consumer consequences arrive within 30 days. The accumulated economic pressure of months of cable severance produces domestic political pressure in Western governments whose publics do not understand why their government's confrontation with Russia is costing them internet access, financial service disruption, and supply chain shortages. The political pressure to resolve the conflict on terms that restore internet connectivity is pressure that operates in every Western democracy simultaneously. Iran used the 90-day ceasefire to buy reconstruction time. Russia has used 42 cable cuts to buy political pressure time. Intelligence advantage. Military communications forced from cable to satellite are military communications that operate in an environment where Russian signals intelligence collection is significantly more capable. Cable communications are physically inaccessible to collection except at termination points. Satellite communications are accessible to collection across the entire footprint of the satellite, a footprint that Russian ground stations and collection platforms can access from positions that collection from cable infrastructure requires physical access to achieve. The shift from cable to satellite for NATO military communications has moved those communications from a collection environment that Russian SIGINT found difficult to a collection environment that Russian SIGINT finds significantly more accessible. Russia has not just degraded NATO communications, it has moved them to the collection environment where Russian intelligence has the greatest advantage. In Moscow, the cable operation has produced the strategic environment modification that Russian military planning has been developing since the identification of submarine cable vulnerability as a strategic target set in the early 2000s, not the disruption of internet access as an end in itself. The creation of a strategic environment in which every Western advantage, financial sanctions, high bandwidth military communications, economic interdependence as diplomatic leverage has been degraded simultaneously by a single coordinated operation. The elegance of the cable operation from a Russian strategic perspective is its comprehensiveness. A single action has degraded financial warfare capability, military communications bandwidth, economic pressure capacity, and intelligence collection difficulty simultaneously. No military operation in this series has produced comparable multi-domain degradation from a single action. In Beijing, the cable operation is being assessed through two simultaneous analytical frameworks whose combination produces the most urgent Chinese strategic calculation since the orbital nuclear test. The first framework is Taiwan. The submarine cable infrastructure that connects Taiwan to international communications includes cables whose route geometry passes through waters adjacent to Chinese naval operational areas. The Russian operation has provided a validated template for cable severance whose application to Taiwan's cable infrastructure produces the communications isolation that a Taiwan blockade requires without the military action that a blockade legally constitutes. Cable severance is not a blockade. It is infrastructure maintenance failure. The Chinese naval assets whose Yantar-class equivalents have been surveying Taiwan's cable routes for 5 years have just received the operational template that their survey work was preparing to execute. The second framework is global financial system leverage. China holds the largest foreign currency reserves of any nation on Earth, approximately $3 trillion, whose management depends on the international financial system's operation. The swift paralysis that cable severance has produced affects Chinese financial operations as well as Western ones. But China's domestic financial infrastructure, its internal payment systems, its domestic market operations, is significantly less dependent on submarine cable international connectivity than Western financial systems. The disruption that cable severance produces falls more heavily on Western financial systems than on Chinese ones. An asymmetric disruption that damages your adversary's financial infrastructure more than your own is a strategic weapon. In every government whose internet-dependent population is experiencing the specific personal disruption that 95% internet loss produces, the inability to access cloud services, the financial transaction failures, the communication disruptions, the political pressure for conflict resolution is building at a rate that the strategic management of the conflict's other dimensions cannot easily absorb. Russia has not just severed cables, it has directly connected the conflict's resolution timeline to the daily lived experience of hundreds of millions of civilians in Western democracies who do not vote on foreign policy positions, but who do vote on governments whose policies have produced internet outage. The political pressure mechanism is unprecedented in warfare history. No previous military action has produced direct personal inconvenience for the civilian populations of adversary nations at the scale that 42 severed cables produce. The civilian populations who are inconvenienced are also the voters whose governments are prosecuting the conflict. The connection between their inconvenience and their vote is the strategic weapon that the cable operation has deployed. I have spent 32 years studying how nations make each other feel the consequences of conflict. The history of warfare is largely the history of making consequences felt, of connecting the decisions that governments make in strategic competition to costs that those governments and their populations cannot ignore. The cable operation has made consequences felt in a way that no previous military action in history has achieved. Not through destruction, through absence. The absence of the connectivity that modern life depends on so completely that its invisibility had become its defining characteristic. 42 cables cut, 11 minutes, 95% of global internet gone, and every person on Earth who has touched a screen in the past decade is now living in the specific daily inconvenience that Russian strategic planning designed this operation to produce. Not the inconvenience of a natural disaster, the inconvenience of a strategic choice. A choice that continues as long as the conflict that produced it continues. The cables can be repaired in months by ships that Russia can harass, in ocean floors that Russia can reach again. And every day of the repair process is a day of continued inconvenience for the civilian populations whose governments are being asked to sustain a conflict whose costs have just become personally immediate. Here is the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments. When a military operation directly connects the outcome of a geopolitical conflict to the daily internet access of hundreds of millions of civilians, when the cost of the conflict is felt not in military casualties, but in everyone's inability to use the services they depend on, does that change the political sustainability of the Western response to Russian aggression? Because from where I sit, having watched Russia systematically attack every assumption that Western power is built on, the cable operation is the most democratically effective weapon Russia has deployed, not because it kills soldiers, because it inconveniences voters, and voters in the long run are more powerful than soldiers. Tell me what you think. Like and share this if the analysis delivered the depth this operation demands. Subscribe for the work that goes where the mainstream will not. I will see you in the next one.